Hello and welcome to In Good Spirits, a podcast where we explore the fascinating world of whisky investments. I'm your host, Thomas Ballantyne, and welcome to today's episode 3 of Whisky Strategies. If you've ever thought about turning your love for whisky into a smart investment strategy, you've come to the right place. Whisky investing is gaining popularity, but for beginners, it can feel a little overwhelming. But don't worry though, in this series, I'm going to break down whisky investing in nice, easy, manageable steps. So whether you're an aficionado or just curious or getting into whisky, you could be equipped with the right knowledge to start investing yourselves. So in this episode, I'm just going to talk through about understanding your whisky goals, the different types of whisky investments you can do, and my own personal whisky investment strategy, which you guys can mirror or you could take it your own way. But once you're equipped with this knowledge, you can go out and build your own whisky portfolio. So let's start at the very beginning. What does it mean to invest in whisky? Simply put, it's the process of purchasing whisky with the goal of seeing a return on that investment as the value of your bottle or cask or investment fund that we'll all touch on appreciates over time. And if you want a more generic overview about whisky investing, I encourage everybody to listen to the very first episode of this season where I give a full overview about this. And the second episode, which will talk to you about the types of language that brokers and the whisky industry likes to use when investing in casks of whisky. But firstly, you really have to understand what your investment goal is and what your risk tolerances are before you do not just whisky investing, but any kind of investing. So first things first, are you looking for short-term gains? Are you planning for long-term haul? Is whisky just a side hobby, a bit of fun? Or is it something you want to be serious as part of a wider portfolio? You need to think about your risk tolerance. Like any investment, whisky comes with its risks. Some bottles or casks can increase in value significantly over time, while some others might not perform as well as you hoped. So when considering whisky as an investment, ask yourself, how much risk am I willing to take on? Do you prefer a more stable investment, more predictable one? And are you willing to go for high risk, high reward opportunities? Now, as I've spoken about in previous shows, whisky is a yearly process and an aging process. You cannot make it go up and down very quickly. This is not a cryptocurrency. This is not a Bitcoin. This is not something that you can buy £10,000 worth of today and the market will suddenly 10x it the next day. This will take time. It's a steady growth and it should always tend upwards just due to the limiting factors of supply, and therefore there's only so much being around and the price should steadily increase year on year. But the downside to that is you obviously have to wait yourselves. So if you are looking for a 5 to 10 year investment, whisky could be the one for you. If you're looking for a year investment, certainly not. I would say anything under 3 to 5 years is probably not the right one for whisky. But also there's other things that you need to consider before you start investing in whisky, such as stock market returns and dividends. Whisky, you don't get any dividends. It's just itself, the asset. Now, it's quite fun to have, but literally you're losing litres each year. So, it's not like you've got a permanent asset. But also there's storage costs, which you don't get with stocks and shares as well. And then there's also very, pardon the pun, liquidity in the marketplace. So like stocks and shares, you tend to get mark-to-market rates. You can normally back out of a position quite quickly. There's lots of buyers and sellers. Whisky, whilst there are a lot of buyers and sellers, it's quite a slow process. And depending on what type of barrel you have, the age, etc., will depend on how popular and how in demand your barrel is. If you've got a relatively young cask, it won't be as high in demand, it won't be as popular than an aged cask. Or if you have a particular bottle, you can't just sell it normally on the open market. The easiest way to do it is through a whisky auction, and whisky auctions take at least a month ahead before you can even submit it to a particular site. They're done monthly, so if you miss one just by a week, you'll have to wait a whole month to submit your whisky, and then payment process could take another month after that. So even if you're buying bottles and you're investing in bottles for the long term, it could take you 2 to 3 months to see any profits or money coming back into your portfolio. But also, as it's an auction, you might not get the returns as you previously wanted. And if you go direct to whisky bottlers or independent whisky shops themselves, they obviously want to make their own money and their own margins. So they want to take probably 20 to 30% off the auction price, and then they will make that margin back by selling it to their own clientele. So think about your risk investments, think about your investment goals. Are you looking for short-term stuff that you can back out quite quickly if you need the cash, or are you happy to kind of put some small cash aside and let it sit there and wait, almost just forget about it, let it just grow up, and then once you're ready to come back to it, you can do with it as you wish, sell it, bottle it, or any of the other exit strategies that we spoke about in the 101. But stay tuned in for later episodes where I can talk about those exit strategies and what I think is best for yourself, but also what's currently best for my strategy and what I would recommend. So now I've just kind of touched on your risk goals and your investment goals and your timeline for investing and seeing returns. So I would say whiskey is a medium term one, plus 5 years would be the minimum I would say to invest in whiskey. That includes bottles and casks. But there are 3 main ways to invest in whiskey. So you've got bottles, casks and funds. So I'm just going to touch on all 3 and provide some examples. First up, bottles. This is probably the most accessible way for most people to get started with whiskey investing. You'll be buying individual bottles, and the value of those bottles will depend on things like rarity, age, distillery reputation and packaging. Popular whiskey brands, limited edition releases, or bottles from closed distilleries or demolished distilleries or mothballed distilleries tend to see higher value over time. A classic one is a whiskey collection bought as a birthday gift every year since 1992, which was sold for £44,000. This collection, consisting of 18-year-old Macallan single malts, was given to Matthew Robinson by his father Pete, who started the tradition with a bottle of 1974 whiskey. Initially intended as a unique gift, the collection unexpectedly became a valuable investment over time. And Matthew, the lucky person who plans to use these bottles and sell them on, plans to use this for a house deposit. And the collection was just sold through a broker and described it as the Macallan Perfect Set of 18-year-olds. And the buyer of this is anonymous, but it was an international buyer, we believe, in Asia. And so the fun side about bottling or buying bottles of whiskey, you don't have to spend too much. This Macallan 18 was probably about £100 when they first started in 74. But the price of a Macallan 18 now probably jumps up to £350 a year. So you could even mirror this strategy now. Macallan is a very famous brand. It's a very strong brand in its reputation. And I don't think they're going anywhere soon. So if you start buying Macallan 18 every year, you can probably even track the history and the prices of that year on year now. So I'd encourage anybody to do some light research on just Macallan 18. See if you can find this year's release in 2024. Then have a look at 2020 and then maybe 2016 release, and then just kind of average the price out for those. And then that's the probably growth that you'll see in your whiskey throughout the next few years and the future and beyond. Now, the annoying thing about bottles is that you have to store them yourself and carry them around with you from place to place. So you have to make sure that they are hidden away at dinner parties. I know quite a few stories of people having investment bottles just meant to be sneakily hidden in a cabinet or a cupboard, and they asked their friends to go and grab a bottle, or maybe they were just too merry of having a good time and they just wanted to open a particular bottle but accidentally opened the wrong one, and then all of that investment is just gone. Also, people smashing it and storing it incorrectly is a very common risk with just investing in bottles. But, that's the trade-off that you get with buying quite easy and quite cheap. For myself, I bought bottles for as low as £55 to start investing in. And you can go, all the way up to how much you really want to spend. Glenfiddich 50-year-old goes up to £20,000. I'd encourage anybody to look at the highest age Macallans. They can go for some silly prices. But again, you've still got the problem of storing it and looking after it yourself. Similar to wine. Everybody has wine cellars. You don't necessarily need a whole cellar. You just need to store it in an upright position and make sure you don't drink it. But with bottles, very, very easy to get into, very, very cheap, and very, very kind of easy to sell on auction sites. Next we have is cask investments. So buying a cask is a whole different ball game. You purchase the entire cask of whiskey, which is then aged and matures over time, normally in a bonded warehouse somewhere in Scotland. And this can be much more expensive as an entry point, but the profit is significantly more, or potentially a lot more. And casks allow you to capture the full maturation process, and depending on the distillery and how long you hold onto the cask and the size of the cask and what's in it, could be a lot higher. I encourage everybody to listen to the previous episode about what's a first fill sherry hogshead. Each one of those components factors into how a cask is priced and then how it goes up. Something that I'll touch on in another episode is what I think the top reputational distilleries are, what the top brands are, and ones that I think that you should certainly look out for in terms of the pricing. But a classic story that everybody kind of goes to in their case studies that you might have seen on the internet or tends to get shown about by brokers to try and get you to invest and entice it is a long-term investing cask of Macallan 1988. So a rare cask of Macallan from 1988 set a new auction record by selling for £1 million. This was a 34-year-old whiskey, and it was bought for just under £5,000 in 1988. The cask contained 374 litres of whiskey, so it was about the size of a hogshead, and was actually rediscovered from the Macallan distillery by reminding the owner that it had the cask maturing there. Almost the perfect investment. Can you imagine that you bought something for £5,000 in 1988? Granted, that was quite a lot of money then, but you just forgot about it, and then the distillery themselves calls you back and say, hey, you're still the owner of this cask. Do you want to bottle it or do you want to sell it? And then you go, you know what? I think I might as well sell it because I'm not using it. I didn't even know it was there. And once they wanted to sell it, they called an auction house, kind of a global auction house. I think it was Bonham's. And the winning bid came from the United States, and it hit a final strike price of £915,000. But then with buyer's premium on top of that, that's where it hit the £1 million mark. So that's why everybody calls it the £1 million whiskey cask. And the cask itself could bottle about 534 bottles, and the previous auction record was about 444,000, set in 2019. And the Macallan was also the previous record holder on that. So for anybody kind of getting the hints about Macallan, as I've said it probably a few times on this show, those are the big boys and the big brand that everybody goes for. They are the top dogs. Now, next episode I'll talk about maybe brand reputation and who are the top guys to look out for, and maybe the top reasons for investing in certain styles. So if everybody knows what a first fill sherry hogshead is, I'll say what part of those components are more desirable and how they then affect the overall whiskey's price in its later years, and what kind of people look for when buying whiskies after you've already invested in them. But that's just another way of doing it. It's cask investment. That's another strategy that you can go for, one that's certainly very popular. You tend to see about 8 to 10% on lower years and younger year stock. But then once you get to the higher age stuff, so by higher age I probably mean anything plus 15 years, that's when you start seeing more significant returns on your whiskey. So that's when you're getting the 15, maybe even 18% returns. But that's quite exceptional. That's quite age stuff. And you tend to pay a lot more of a premium to get access to those types of casks. So those new age stuff, those very, very low age stuff, you can probably buy as little as £2,000. And then if you want to buy the age stuff, you're then talking 10, 15, 25, 30. You start getting to those ballpark figures per cask. And my own personal journey, I did get offered a cask of Macallan. I wasn't quite 31 or 34 years old as the story was earlier. It was only 19 years old, but that was for £250,000. So even still, if you had hold that for 4 to 5 years, it could have been quite phenomenal amount of returns on that. But fortunately, don't have that kind of money lying around to spend £250,000 on whiskey. And I think if I told that to my fiance, she would probably take my head off if I said I was going to buy £250,000 worth of whiskey. Now for a fun one, and a definitely different one that probably nobody's heard about, and these are whiskey investment funds. So this is more of a collective investment where you pool your money with other investors to buy bottles or casks, and it's a way of getting into whiskey investing without the upfront cost of buying a whole cask yourself. So with funds, you benefit from diversification. It's a less hands-on way to get involved. And it's kind of like just, grouping to buy significant shares or buying, massive real estate together. You might only pitch up of this £1 million property, only 10% of it, but you've got your 10% share, and then everybody agrees that after 5 years you go to sell it. So an example of this, if you want to really look into these types of ones, is the Platinum Whisky Investment Fund, which was one of the world's first private equity funds to focus on rare and single malt whiskies. These guys organised in 2014, had a projected term of 7 years, and the fund has now announced its successful liquidation. So organised in 2014, lasted for 7 years, and then liquidated it all. The fund had initially $12 million, and the fund generated net proceeds of $26 million. So that had a gross annual rate of return of about 17%, showing you that, if you pool your assets together and you buy in a fund, you can really make significant money. Now, I'm not saying that this fund was just done between 5 people. The funds can vary between however sizes, but fund investment in whiskey is out there, and it is a fun way of doing it. But to go a bit more specific on this Platinum Whisky Investment Fund, it was launched in June 2014, raised $12 million, as I mentioned, and the $12 million was raised through 50 high net worth individuals. That's about £240,000 investment. So these were based in Hong Kong, Singapore, China, UK, and a few other European locations like Switzerland. And it offered a unique investment vehicle focused on old and rare single malt whiskies, bought from Scotland and Japan. And over the past 5 years, the fund traded thousands of bottles of investment-grade whiskies through auctions and whiskey trading companies, and goes to show how whiskey investment funds, is a real strong case for them for being an alternative asset investment than just stocks and shares or alternative assets of cars and Rolexes and watches and whatever else is out there for the alternative investment industry. And then another one I would just want to bring your attention that I won't talk through is the Cask 100 fund. Again, $20 million, 5-year investment vehicle. Have a look at it online. It's a very interesting case study, similar to what the previous one of Platinum Whisky did with their investment fund. Bought and sold high-end collectible whiskies from different distilleries as well. They also bought wines as a bit of a diversification of their portfolio, but then again showed quite significant returns on their investments. So those are the 3 areas of investing in whiskey that you can look at. You've got your own personal bottle collection, you've got your own cask collection, and then you've got shared funds as well. So I encourage everybody to look into all 3 of different time horizons and different pluses and minuses, but all are really great to invest in whiskey, and you just have to tailor that to your own personal way of investing and what your risk tolerance is, as I mentioned at the beginning, but also your investment strategy and what you would like to actually invest and put up front. Can you wait 15, 20 years for a cask, or can you put up more capital up front and maybe get some cash out earlier on? Now, I want to share a bit about my personal approach to whiskey investment, specifically through casks. When I first started, I wasn't focusing on buying casks for quick profits. I was certainly looking as a long-term strategy for my approach. But my strategy for this was to look at it as a new make spirit and look at it as almost a pension fund for myself for when I retire. So for those of you who don't know, a new make spirit is basically whiskey that hasn't been aged yet. I touched on that on the previous episode. It's completely colourless, and it's basically whiskey before it's had its actual maturation. So when I invested in new make spirit, I was betting on its future potential, knowing that in the long haul, I'm going to see my returns. And my plan was to hold them, as I mentioned, 10 to 15 years at least, and maybe even 25, 30 years as a potential pension pot for myself as a way of living on each year. So the way I was looking at it for myself was I'd buy one a year for £2,000 to £3,000, and then as it gets to 30 years old, I can then sell it for hopefully £30,000, £40,000, £50,000, and that's just a top up of my pension or whatever I want to live on that year. And then because I've been accumulating 30 casks over 30 years, when I come to sell the oldest one at the time, it's 30 years old, I'll have a 30-year-old cask every year that I can sell. And because it's very tax efficient in the UK, as I spoke about in the 101, Hopefully that's a really good chunk of income that I could use to treat myself to a fun holiday with my family, or I could buy myself a fun new car, or I could pay off some debt that maybe I've still got left over, hopefully not when I've retired, but basically use those funds for whatever I want to do. Live life to the fullest and have some fun stuff, maybe even retire early and chill out in the sun somewhere. But what my strategy is as well is not only buying this new make spirit now, but once I get in this first batch, say 10 years old, and I've got maybe 2 to 3 barrels which are ready to go, hopefully they'll be hitting this kind of 8 to 15k mark. And what I'll be looking to do is sell my barrels, and then reinvest those into a second wave of new make spirit. So hopefully I can then buy, instead of just having the one barrel that's going to age, I can then buy maybe 5 or 6. And then just for the first kind of 5 or 10 batches, I think I'm going to reinvest those, sell and reinvest, and basically enlarge my own portfolio to quite a sizable cask investment. And hopefully that just kind of funds itself. So once I hit maybe 50 or 60 casks, I know that the fund itself is kind of self-sustainable. And once I get to a large enough pot, the ones which are then quite high in value, I can maybe sell those and buy even more premium ones that I can happily wait for. So ones which are like the Macallans, I can maybe get into those, or other whiskies which are already 20 to 30 years old that I can invest in, maybe only hold for 3 to 4 years. I have a shorter time horizon. I can back out of those a bit easier and maybe make some more significant returns on those types of whiskey. So that's kind of my strategy, using it as a pension, as a future-proof thing, but also once in the next 10 years I have a few barrels to start reinvesting those and buying younger stock over and over again. Once I get to a large enough size, kind of happy for it to sit there, and then use that for my fun stuff and whatever I want to do in the future. But as I mentioned, cask investment takes a long time. So there's no way I can really quick up this process. It's something that I can just kind of soldier on with and just keep a note as to how well it's doing and how well it's performing. And hopefully this strategy in the long run is quite shock absorbent from the global economy, because it's got its very own set process in terms of how it's made and its production cycle. It's not like these stocks and shares or Bitcoin where it's super volatile and you're going to make 10x or lose 10x all in the same day. It's a lot more steady investment process. So that's it. That's just that's all I have time for today. That's 3 different types of ways of investing in whiskey. You've got your bottles, you've got your casks, and you've got your funds. All 3 ways are fun and interesting. And I encourage everybody to think about what they would like to do. Maybe they want to touch on all 3. Myself, I'm much more into the bottles and casks than I am about the funds, but the funds could be a very easy way and hands-off way of doing it if you don't want the hassle of storage and looking after the bottles and kind of worrying about insurance and all this kind of stuff about physically owning the casks. But some people like physically owning the casks because it's quite a fun story to tell your friends, but also something that's a bit more personal to you, knowing that it's your barrel, it's your stuff, and you can kind of do with it as you wish and as you want. Remember, whiskey is not only an investment of money, but it's an investment in knowledge. The more you learn about the industry, the better equipped you'll be to make wise decisions. And hopefully, the more you listen into this podcast, you'll become ever wiser and ever more knowledgeable about the industry itself. And as I go through these podcasts and these journey myself, I can take you on this adventure about how you should invest, what some of the pitfalls that I've gone into, and kind of give you some steer as to, what whiskey investing is all about. But thanks for joining me today on Whisky Strategies, or whiskey types of investments. In future episodes, I'm going to talk about the value of whiskey and how it's derived, and maybe the top 10 distilleries that I would look out for, the top 10 barrels to look out for, and the different valuations that I've seen in the market to give you some real life information. I've got lots of casks that I've bought and sold, but also I've got lots of database from talking to brokers about current prices of whiskey, so I can give you guys a live examples about what I've bought, what I've not bought, what's gone up in price, and what has the more reputable distillery name that you could want to look for and want to look to buy. So again, thank you for joining me. Please like, share, subscribe to the page. It helps me out a whole bunch. I've really appreciated all the support so far. It's been absolutely fantastic. I really appreciate all the comments and all the feedback I've been getting, both just at home and in the office. It's been absolutely amazing. And, my motivation comes from you guys giving me all these extra questions that you want to hear about, what you want to hear about more on the show, and just kind of more general knowledge about whiskey that you guys want to find out. So thank you all for listening, and good night.